All right, so I apologize in advance. This video is going to have low audio, so you might have to turn up your audio. I'm trying to find a good microphone for my phone. I use my phone to film, and all the microphones I've used have really sucked. Okay, so this is going to be more of like a long, uh, droning on kind of vlog post with low audio. All right, so I wanted to talk about a few things. First of all, Ken Wheeler did a recent video addressing consciousness after death, which is absolutely amazing. Um, and I encourage him to keep talking about the subject since it is important. I know a lot of electric universe people, all those those electrical engineer guys. I think maybe their motivations are rooted in something like free energy or whatnot, which is, you know, uh, it's good if you want to have a Star Trek like kind of society. But really, what's even more important than that, regarding the core issues of fields and everything, is this topic of what happens after you die. And I'm so glad that Ken has started talking about consciousness, because Ken is really the only one out of all of them who understand and adhere to an ontological basis, specifically monism. And I think that people who do decide to adhere to an ontological basis, it's pretty much always going to be monism. Because I seriously think that a lot of people who are not believers in monism just simply don't understand it. And I mean what I'm saying is it's very, very rare to find someone who understands what monism is in relationship to the other ontological positions, and who doesn't think that monism is correct. So all of these authors throughout history talking about religion or the occult or psychology, all of these authors throughout history, and even experts of consciousness today, do not say one thing, which is very, very important, I think, to help people understand what is going on. And I think that every time someone talks about the subject, it should start with this: there are multiple ways to view things, and some of them make more sense than others. So what the ways to view things are, there are four of them. And no matter who you are, you can't really be agnostic or atheist on ontology. You pretty much fall under one or another category, sometimes a mixture, because people contradict themselves all the time when they speak confidently on these subjects, but don't adhere to a basis in ontology. They don't stick to a particular position in ontology. So the four are physicalism, idealism, dualism, and neutral monism. So in the context of life after death, I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm going to phrase it this way. If you are a physicalist, then you believe that no one has consciousness. Consciousness just doesn't exist, whether you're alive or dead. And when you die, things just go dark, you go away. You weren't really there to begin with, I guess. It's kind of confusing. Physicalists haven't really given the question much thought. And it's really just an assumption. Oh, you just go away after you die. Of course, no one knows. This is the caveat. You do not know what it's like to be dead because you have not died and have been resurrected. And that caveat really, really angers people who have had near-death experiences. People who have had near-death experiences and are alive today did not actually die. They were simply resuscitated. And that's why they call it a near-death experience, not a death experience. Because actually, death is when there's, less brain activity. But when you're experiencing a near-death experience, there's actually an increase in brain activity. It's reasonable to suggest. I mean, it just depends on what your ontological position is. So let me just continue. So there's physicalism. So idealism is the opposite. Idealism is you believe that, well, basically everything's made of consciousness, and physical stuff doesn't really exist. And a lot of idealists say that, well, that person over there, they're God of their own universe. But really, they're just being polite. What idealists, if you really, really ask them, if you keep trying to figure out what they actually believe, 10 out of 10 times, an idealist will say that they themselves are God and dream up everyone else and all of reality, and that life is simply a dream. And a lot of people who've had near-death experiences fall under that category. And one of the reasons they do that is because, well, one of the experiences in a near-death experience is the sensation of waking up from real life or waking just normal consciousness. But that does not mean that life is a dream. All that means is that, so like, for example, where do you go when you go to sleep? I ask that question because when you wake up, it feels like you came back from somewhere. Every morning when you wake up, you have this, self-awareness, like a light bulb turns on. You're now conscious, like, oh, now I'm awake. And that's because your brain was less coherent when you're sleeping, and when you wake up, there's an increase in coherence. And what a near-death experience is an additional increase in coherence. And so it's natural it's reasonable to anticipate that same sensation about the normal level of consciousness. If you raise your consciousness again, if more of your brain is coherent, which I'm pretty sure that's what happens during a near-death experience. So that's all it is. So there's physicalism, there's idealism. If you're a dualist, you believe that your consciousness is immortal and not dependent upon your physical body. So when you die, your consciousness simply leaves your body, undamaged, unchanged. And obviously that doesn't make sense at all because, well, when you go to sleep, your consciousness reduces, and dualists really ignore that. So anyway, the fourth ontological position is neutral monism, which is the understanding that the physical and the non-physical are related. They're interconnected. You can't really have one without the other. Therefore, they're basically the same thing. The one, the monad, whatever. And so that's why they call it monism. And so basically what that means is that whatever happens to your body, your consciousness is affected. However, there's panpsychism. There's consciousness inherent in everything. According to panpsychists, monists, there's consciousness in everything. And so it's not really like physicalism. There's no assumption that, well, you just kind of fade away forever. The belief generally is that you would lose your self-awareness, but your consciousness wouldn't end. You would just, because there's consciousness, it wouldn't really be you, but there's consciousness still, and you're connected to it. And religions that are monist go into greater detail about this, because a lot of religions have kind of like a Neoplatonist or monist basis, and they say stuff along the lines like your memories and your consciousness is kind of like embedded in the environment, and so there's always some kind of mechanism that allows for you to be revived in the distant future at some point in time. And that's actually why people in monist religions try to preserve their body, not because they know how to resurrect people, but they just reason that, well, in the future when people have probably better technology or magic or something that can, and if you're expecting to be resurrected in the future, you would think that if your body's preserved well, then it would make the job easier for them. Okay, and that's why a lot of people, even today, try and preserve their bodies. Well, actually, a lot of the elites are monists, and they, like for example, in Freemasonry, that's why they store their dead bodies in crypts. They hide their bodies in crypts and trying to, for that reason, they're expecting to be resurrected. And I think that's if there's any gamble to join in, I think that's probably the most reasonable one to join in. I would be against, personally, I'd be against being cremated. Of course, there's no no one knows how to resurrect people. So I I I could probably begin to guess at the mechanism for resurrection, but I have no idea. I'm that's actually the path I'm going down. That's one of the paths I'm going down. That's kind of why I'm doing these vlog things, because I'm thinking about these mechanisms, and I just want it to be out there, because not everyone's thinking about this stuff. Today, we're in a dark age, ontologically speaking. People are not taught these things. That's actually when you learn about like the esoteric sides of religions, like you like the elders that have secret knowledge of the religion. Well, the explicit reason they keep it secret, explicitly stated, is to keep it monist, so that people are not confused. So all you have to do is just trust whatever the elders say. And in some religions, they still have that, because they have that system. But the like regular Protestant Western Christianity, completely laid out by subversion, by mass obfuscation. Well, I don't want to get into that, but so anyway, yeah, it's good that Ken's talking about this. I encourage him to do it more, and if Ken is listening, I challenge you to somehow integrate your knowledge of magnetism into the subject, if you can at all, because my view of fields and magnetism is slightly different than Ken's, and that's what I do. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. And the next thing I wanted to talk about is basically an addition to my last vlog type video, where I am starting to realize that maybe magnetism itself and other forces, magnetic fields, and other forces like electric fields, or whatever, whatever words you want to use, they are also forms of consciousness, even though your human brain is probably not chemically set up to perceive those kinds of forces, those qualia. And so since then, I've been thinking about that more, and like I said, a lot of people are really they contradict themselves when they talk about these subjects. They contradict themselves because, like, one sentence is dualist. I watched some this video by the quantum research people about how we live in a simulation, or the Matrix or something. And I was scrolling through the comments, and one comment that was highly upvoted was some Karen Cheryl looking lady saying, "Yeah, the more I study it, the more I research it, the more I believe that everything is consciousness." See, that's what I'm talking about. So the video itself is promoting dualism. is promoting dualism, and they're making arguments for dualism. And then people in the comments were saying, "Oh yeah, idealism." Idealism. And they're, even though they're hearing arguments for dualism, they're saying, "Oh yeah, idealism," because people don't cannot tell the difference between these things. And that's because it's not these things are not taught. Like I said, no one says that they're these things and they're different, and this is how they're different. No one says that. Everyone makes it confusing. It's not confusing. Also, what I'm trying to point out is that they are actually very similar to each other. They're very similar to each other. And that's why it's so easy for people to go back and forth between one and the other. Because you really have to understand the differences, the really fine differences between them. I mean, when you take a step back, they're completely different, but the core and there's only 4 of them, and just little tiny differences on a big scale make them different. So that's why people are confused. So I did want to talk mostly about idealism, like this lady was saying, because people say this stuff all the time, like, "Oh yeah, everything's made out of consciousness." Well, that is an ontological basis of idealism, and I don't think idealism is correct. I think monism is correct. But they're very, very, unless you're trained to know the difference, you can't tell the difference. There are very many similarities, and a lot of theories, like in physics, a lot of these theories of everything, they don't have an ontological basis, and therefore they're basically completely worthless, because they themselves, these people creating a theory about the nature of reality, don't even address ontology. I mean, you had one job, dude. You had one job. But they contradict each other because they don't have an ontological basis. And they just feel like they can just switch back and forth between these things. But all of these theories sound pretty much the same, and you could basically take any one of these theories, and like you could take an idealist theory, and even though you're a dualist, you could say, "Oh, see, look, this is proof of my idealism," or "This is proof of my dualism." Whatever you want to do. It's just so first of all, in my book, Consciousness' Coherence and Ontological Basis, I put forth my own theory, which is, of course, very similar to all these other theories. And a lot of people have had theories where there's like reality bubbles. And the whole reality bubble thing sounds very idealist. To state that thing right there is basically the center of the universe and has its own reality bubble, that sounds very idealist. And an idealist would look at that and say, "See, look, that's idealist." But actually, that thing has its reality bubble. That thing has its own reality bubble. Everything has its own reality bubble. And this is what all the 20th century physicists said. I mean, this is literally what reference frames are. And you can say whatever you want about Einstein, but the physicists worship Einstein and yet contradict him all the time. But that's basically what reference frames are. They're talking about reality bubbles. The difference between that and idealism is that in idealism, you're the only reality bubble. But in this reality bubble, monism, which physicists were monists up until very recently. The difference between that and idealism is that in this one, there are different reality bubbles, and the fields are self-similar and hierarchical. And this bubble and this bubble make the poles of a larger bubble, I think. And so between the bubbles there are objective realities. So there is an actual objective reality, which goes against idealism. There is no objective reality in idealism. So there's that. Sounds kind of like idealism. Big difference. Okay, so adding on to my last vlog where I was talking about maybe magnets are conscious. That's kind of another thing that points towards idealism, but it really isn't. So let's say there are a range of forces, and characteristics. There are a range of characteristics, and they're all you could consider them forms of consciousness. And basically, these characteristics are the essences, which, or you could say the word ether, or nous. But there are a bunch of different words for it. But the non-physical. But that's not a good word. That's a confusing word. So there are these characteristics that are inherent to matter, but it's not like, well, here's the characteristic and here's the matter. Like, it's not like here's the matter and the characteristics are inside it. Just like you don't have a soul. The physical and the non-physical are related, interdependent, and on the smallest, the quantum scale, using that reasoning, you would expect that there isn't really a difference between physical and non-physical. It's kind of like the characteristics themselves make up the matter. That's a way to view it. And so if you take that and you say, well, if you suggest that maybe you could consider them different kinds of consciousness or different qualia, then an idealist would look at that and say, see, look, everything's made out of consciousness. Consciousness is the base substance. And no, that's not idealism. Like, for example, Ken, in his latest video, he was saying he was challenging people to come up with something that doesn't have any characteristics. Another way to kind of word that is to try. So that's a challenge actually for idealists. That's kind of what I'm talking about. Is these people who are mixing up monism, neutral monism, and idealism. And so that's kind of like saying, describe the color red. It's kind of the same. It's like the hard problem of consciousness, but for idealists. Because the hard problem of consciousness is more directed at physicalists who say that the consciousness emerges from brain activity. There wasn't any consciousness, and then brain activity, and then boom, consciousness. But they also say it doesn't exist, so kind of confusing. But the hard problem of consciousness is geared at the hard problem, which is what brain process does consciousness come from? And that's it. That's a question to make you think of the ontology of consciousness. And so the same exact question, but for idealists, is describe the color red. And this kind of question, the color red is like a meme in phenomenology, so that's why I use it. But I'm rewording it for it to be a challenge to idealists, like a hard problem for idealists. So describe the color red. So obviously the answer is you can't describe the color red. So why can't you describe the color red? Because, well, red is already a description. You can't really describe a description. So a way you could explain that is, well, there are descriptions out there that actually exist. Descriptions are out there. They exist outside of your own mind. You didn't make them. They're in objective reality. They are outside of your they're not created by you. They are a part of objective reality. Just like you're a part of objective reality. And so basically the conclusion is that if you say that everything is made of consciousness, that is idealism and therefore inaccurate. Even though it's very, very it's just the semantics. Okay, it's just this one should understand that this discussion of ontology is not of human beings deciding amongst themselves what reality is or what it's going to be, but our limited intelligence is trying to grasp what we can, and that's why we talk to each other, is to help each other understand things that are hard to understand. And there are so many things that are not understood. Even if you're an expert in ontology, there's a point where there's a limit. There's an upper limit of what you can explain. And basically the whole thing is just juggling paradoxes. Which paradox is better than the other? All physicalism, idealism, and dualism, they all have what's called infinite regress. Basically, what's that made out of? Oh, that's made out of physical stuff. What's physical stuff made out of? Physical stuff. Or if you ask, what's that made of? That's made of consciousness. Well, what's consciousness made of? More consciousness stuff, like smaller consciousness things. And of course, what's that made of is a bad question to ask, but it's a necessary question, and if you ask that question, you end up with infinite regress, unless you're a monist. And the answer is there are two categories. You could call them substance and essence, because non-physical and physical make it confusing. Substance and essence, but they're the same thing because they have a relationship, and therefore the single category is what everything emanates from. Some call it God, some call it there's a bunch of names for it. Yeah, so I kind of lost my train of thought, but pretty much said everything. I can drone on about this for days. uh, so so yeah.